Welcome to Reddit Trends, where I share interesting, useful, and inspiring content. Let's explore the world together with the videos I create. The story starts simply with a small act of kindness, but the note that was passed on afterwards revealed an unexpected secret. What could make a boy and a stranger, an elderly lady, change each other's lives in just a few short minutes? Let's find out together. Don't forget to hit the follow button so you won't miss anything new. Thank you for stopping by, and I hope we'll have amazing experiences together. Alex Carter, a 24-year-old man, slumped onto a crowded bus after a grueling day. Working two jobs, a machine operator during the day and a cleaner at night, had left his body aching and his mind heavy. The weight of his life's struggles, from his mother's illness to the mounting bills, hung over him like a dark cloud. The bus jolted as it came to a stop, and Alex rubbed his tired eyes. Just then, an elderly woman boarded. Her frail frame swayed as she struggled to find balance in the swaying vehicle. Without hesitation, Alex stood up and offered his seat. "Thank you, young man," the woman, Mrs. Evelyn Blake, said softly as she sank into the seat. As the bus lurched forward, Alex stood gripping a handrail, his mind returning to his worries. He barely noticed when Mrs. Blake slipped a small note into his jacket pocket before getting off at her stop. Later that evening, while taking off his jacket, Alex found the note. He unfolded it to find an address and a strange code scrawled beneath it. His brow furrowed in confusion. What could it mean? And why had this old woman given it to him? He went to bed that night with the note resting on his nightstand, but sleep eluded him. His mind kept drifting back to the mystery of that note. The next morning, Alex couldn't shake the thought of the note. It stayed on his mind as he went through his routine, from his early shift at the factory to his late cleaning job. Every time he reached into his pocket, he felt the crumpled piece of paper, a constant reminder of the odd encounter with Mrs. Blake. By the time he returned home late that evening, curiosity had gotten the better of him. He unfolded the note again, staring at the address and the cryptic code. Who was Mrs. Blake, really? And why had she given him this? His thoughts raced as he considered the possibilities. Was it some kind of trap? Or perhaps something more innocent, maybe she needed help with something? His mind bounced between skepticism and intrigue. Alex knew his life was hard enough as it was, but something about the mysterious note tugged at him. He decided he had to find out more. After a few days of pondering, Alex finally made up his mind. On his day off, he would visit the address. He didn't know what to expect, but the urge to uncover the truth was too strong to ignore. The cryptic message had stirred something in him, something that he couldn't quite explain. On his next day off, Alex stood outside the address written on the note, staring up at the large estate that loomed before him. The high iron gates and sprawling grounds made it clear that whoever lived here had considerable wealth. His heart raced as doubt crept in. Was this a mistake? What if it was a trap? But his curiosity pushed him forward. He pulled out the note once more, eyes fixating on the cryptic code written beneath the address. Taking a deep breath, he punched the code into the security pad at the gate. To his surprise, the gates creaked open, inviting him inside. Alex hesitated for a moment, then stepped through, the heavy gates closing behind him with a soft clang. The path led him to the grand entrance of the mansion. As he approached the door, it swung open before he could knock. Standing there was Mrs. Blake, the same elderly woman he had met on the bus. She greeted him with a gentle smile. "I've been expecting you, Alex," she said, as if this meeting had been planned all along. Stunned, Alex followed her inside the massive house. Once seated, Mrs. Blake explained that she was in need of a caretaker, as her health was failing and she had no one to rely on. She offered him the job, with a salary that was 6 times what he was currently making. After a brief moment of disbelief, Alex accepted the offer. Alex quickly settled into his new role as Mrs. Blake's caretaker. The work was light, mostly making sure she took her medications, preparing simple meals, and helping her around the house. As the days went by, a bond began to form between them. Mrs. Blake shared stories from her youth, tales of her life before the grand estate, and even some regrets. Her words were filled with wisdom, and Alex found himself listening intently, soaking in every piece of advice she gave. He couldn't help but see Mrs. Blake as the grandmother he never had. Her warmth and kindness were a stark contrast to the harsh world outside the mansion. The estate, which had once intimidated him, now felt like a second home. He took his duties seriously, wanting to repay her for her generosity. But as much as Alex appreciated the stability of his new life, his thoughts often drifted back to his mother. She was sick with leukemia and needed a bone marrow transplant, but they didn't have the money to afford the procedure. Mrs. Blake noticed the weight on his shoulders and asked about his family. Though hesitant at first, Alex opened up, telling her about his mother's illness and the financial burden it placed on him. Mrs. Blake listened quietly, offering her support and assuring Alex that things would work out, though Alex couldn't help but feel the constant pressure of time running out. Alex quickly settled into his new role as Mrs. Blake's caretaker. The work was light, mostly making sure she took her medications, preparing simple meals, and helping her around the house. As the days went by, a bond began to form between them. Mrs. Blake shared stories from her youth, tales of her life before the grand estate, and even some regrets. Her words were filled with wisdom, and Alex found himself listening intently, soaking in every piece of advice she gave. He couldn't help but see Mrs. Blake as the grandmother he never had. Her warmth and kindness were a stark contrast to the harsh world outside the mansion. The estate, which had once intimidated him, now felt like a second home. He took his duties seriously, wanting to repay her for her generosity. But as much as Alex appreciated the stability of his new life, his thoughts often drifted back to his mother. She was sick with leukemia and needed a bone marrow transplant, but they didn't have the money to afford the procedure. Mrs. Blake noticed the weight on his shoulders and asked about his family. Though hesitant at first, Alex opened up, telling her about his mother's illness and the financial burden it placed on him. Mrs. Blake listened quietly, offering her support and assuring Alex that things would work out, though Alex couldn't help but feel the constant pressure of time running out. Alex was rushed to the hospital that night, his wound serious but not life-threatening. Mrs. Blake insisted on staying by his side, her gratitude evident in every word she spoke. She offered him time off to recover, urging him to rest and heal, but Alex refused to leave her alone. After the terrifying break-in, he couldn't bear the thought of her being left vulnerable. As the days passed, Alex recovered slowly but remained at Mrs. Blake's side, more protective than ever. Their bond grew stronger during this time, with Mrs. Blake becoming like family to him. She, in turn, took on a more maternal role, concerned about his health and well-being. Despite the lingering fear from the break-in, they continued their routine, though something had shifted. Alex had opened up more about his mother's illness, revealing the true extent of their financial struggles. Mrs. Blake listened intently, her face creased with concern, though she didn't offer any solutions. She simply reassured him that things would work out, even as Alex remained anxious about his mother's deteriorating condition. Each day, as he carried out his duties, the weight of his mother's illness pressed harder on his shoulders. He couldn't shake the feeling of helplessness, knowing that without the money for her transplant, her time was running out. Yet, Mrs. Blake's quiet strength kept him going, her presence a comforting reminder that he wasn't facing his struggles alone. One cold night, Alex sat by Mrs. Blake's bedside, as had become his routine since the break-in. Her health had continued to decline, and she was now more frail than ever. Alex had grown used to the quiet hours spent with her, reading aloud from books or simply talking about life. But that night, something felt different. Mrs. Blake's breathing was more labored, her eyes distant. Despite his growing concern, Alex stayed by her side, holding her hand and speaking softly to her, hoping to comfort her as best he could. But as the night wore on, her breaths became shallower, and the peaceful rise and fall of her chest slowed. Alex felt a knot form in his stomach as he realized what was happening. Sometime before dawn, Mrs. Blake passed away quietly in her sleep. Alex sat in stunned silence, his hand still holding hers. Despite knowing her health was failing, he had grown so attached to her that the loss hit him harder than he had expected. It felt as though he had lost a family member, someone who had cared for him and supported him in ways no one else had. The funeral was a somber affair. Alex stood by, heart heavy, as Mrs. Blake was laid to rest. The mansion, once filled with her presence, now felt empty and cold. Her passing left a void in his life, and with it came the crushing realization that he was once again alone with his burdens. His mother's illness still loomed, and now, without Mrs. Blake, the future seemed even more uncertain. A few weeks after Mrs. Blake's passing, Alex received an unexpected visit from her lawyer. 2 other men accompanied him, carrying several documents. The lawyer explained that Mrs. Blake had left behind a detailed will, and to Alex's astonishment, he was the primary beneficiary. She had left her entire estate, including her mansion and considerable business investments, to him. Alex sat in stunned silence as the lawyer outlined the details. Mrs. Blake had no living family, and she had grown fond of Alex during their time together. His kindness and loyalty had clearly made a deep impact on her, leading her to reward him in ways he never could have imagined. With the wealth now at his disposal, Alex found himself in a completely different position. He was no longer the struggling young man working 2 jobs just to get by. He could finally afford the bone marrow transplant his mother desperately needed. The financial burden that had weighed so heavily on him was suddenly lifted. The surgery was arranged almost immediately, and Alex watched as his mother began her journey toward recovery. The relief he felt was overwhelming, knowing that her life had been saved. As he stood in the mansion that now belonged to him, Alex reflected on the incredible turn his life had taken. It all traced back to that single moment of kindness, offering his seat to Mrs. Blake on the bus. That small gesture had changed everything, leading him to a life he could never have dreamed of. Thank you for listening. See you in the next episode. Take care of yourself and your loved ones. Goodbye.